Finishing your cold, damp, and dark basement is a great way to get some extra space for you and your family. But if you don't do it properly, you're still going to have a cold, damp, and dark basement, but now it's cost you a lot of money and nobody actually wants to spend any time down there because it's not comfortable, it's not enjoyable, and it's not healthy. We have to remember that basements are sitting in the ground, and as such, they are highly susceptible to moisture issues, and we have to treat them differently than the rest of the house. This is true for all basements, but it's especially true for much older homes that have rubble foundations, which is going to have other issues that we won't get into in this video, but it's also extremely important for new homes because new foundations will release thousands of gallons of water into that space over the first few years that you're living in them. In this video, I'm going to share 5 things that are going to make sure that you end up with a comfortable basement. Number 1 is the walls. How are we going to build the wall assembly? So we want to make sure that the air cannot condense on the cold foundation in the middle of the winter, and we want to make sure that the moisture that is coming out of that foundation can dry towards the inside if needed. So this is important in new homes. As I've already mentioned, there can be thousands of gallons that's being released from that new foundation into the home. And if you have, for example, poly on the inside of that wall, all that moisture is going to hit the back of the poly and not be able to go anywhere else. So it's just going to sit there. It's going to turn the mold out the fiberglass insulation if that's what you're using. That's the most common type of insulation that we see, or potentially the wood studs as well. And you won't know it's a problem until it's too late. Another potential issue is that warm air getting into your wall assembly, getting to that cold foundation in the middle of the winter and condensing there, which can also lead to mold and other issues. So it all comes down to moisture control and surface temperature. That's what we need to think about when we are thinking about renovating our basement and making sure that we do it properly so that it is a comfortable space. Here's an example of a wall assembly that we used in a recent basement renovation of an older home. We used an EPS rigid insulation with a barrier over top of it. The EPS stands for expanded polystyrene. And we put this directly on the foundation wall. All the joints were sealed and it was tied in with the spray foam that was put into the headers at the top of the foundation. So the headers would be between the joists. This gives us a nice continuous insulation air barrier, which ultimately is going to get connected to some exterior work that they're doing in a future phase. In front of this, we used 2x4 wood studs, but we left a 1.5 inch airspace so that we could add 5.5 inches of hemp insulation in between all of the studs. On top of that, we then used a smart vapor barrier, which would allow the assembly to dry in either direction. Now, this isn't the only assembly or necessarily the best assembly. It really depends on what you need for your basement. This wall assembly met all the criteria that was needed for the homeowners in this case. Number 2 is the floor. We want to make sure that the floor feels warm, and if you've walked on a floor that has radiant heat, you know what I'm talking about. Now, we don't need to necessarily put radiant heat into your basement, but we do need to think about how we make that floor feel warmer than what it actually might be. Now, if you're building a new home, it's really easy. We can actually separate that slab from the ground by putting insulation underneath it and separate it from the foundation, but in a renovation, that's going to get quite costly. So in this case, we're going to have to put something on top of the floor to make sure that that floor has that break from the cold concrete, and we also need to still make sure that we're mitigating any moisture that might be coming up through that slab. If you're in an older house, chances are there isn't any sort of moisture mitigation below that slab, so any water that gets below your house can just come up through the floor and into your basement. Now, adding insulation on top of your basement slab isn't always possible because you might not have enough headroom, or maybe it's going to mess with the last stair. So when you come down, that last tread ends up being too short compared to the rest of them. In either case, if you can somehow make this work, it's going to have a significant impact on the comfort of your basement. Even if you can spare a couple of inches, that can have a big impact. So here's an example of what we did in a 20-year-old home where we renovated the basement. For this particular basement, there was no vapor barrier under the slab, and the team figured this out when they roughed in the plumbing for the new bathroom. So in this case, the team put down a 15 mil poly and then went over top of that with an insulated panel which had OSB stuck to it, and then the finished floor went on top of this. Now, a word of caution to set some expectations. We did use a simple foam panel before. It was supposed to actually be a premium product, but it didn't have OSB stuck to it. And the clients weren't happy because it did not feel solid when they walked on top of it. And this is common if you're just putting a foam panel down on top of a slab and then putting a floating floor on top of that. The floating floor already doesn't feel as solid as your typical floor. So if you're going to be basically putting a floating floor on top of something else that's floating that has some flex to it, it's not going to feel as solid as what you are used to. Number 3 is the exterior. Yes, I know we're talking about the interior and finishing your basement, but making sure that the exterior of the foundation is protected properly is going to have a big impact on the moisture that gets into your basement. And there's 2 really simple things that you can do that don't have to cost very much money at all. Number 1 is grading. Just make sure that all of the ground slopes away from your house. And number 2 would be gutters. If you install gutters, that'll catch all the water that's coming off of your roof instead of coming straight down and splashing all of your foundation and then getting all that moisture into the concrete and then eventually it having to go somewhere. So if we can keep the water from getting to your foundation in the first place, that is going to be key to keeping the moisture out of your basement. Number 4 is windows. Now, this isn't going to help you in terms of a thermal comfort, but is going to add some daylight into the space, and that can have a huge impact in how you feel in that new basement of yours. So if you can add larger windows, I highly recommend it. If you're only doing your basement for movies, then maybe you don't want any windows. However, if this is going to be your office or a bedroom, having a larger window will have that impact that we're looking for. Now, when you add a larger window, you will need to add a window well, and you want to make sure that you do that window well properly. So that means making sure that you do all the drainage properly and potentially having to add insulation to make sure that your footings don't heave because you've got too close to them and now the frost can get to them into the winter. So you'll have to talk to your engineer and your builder and make sure that's done properly, but those are things that you'll need to consider. Another thing that's really great for window wells is doing a larger stepped window well where you can put some gardens in there. So when you look out the window, it'll actually open it up so it'll allow for more daylight to come through, but you'll actually have a nicer view instead of looking at a steel window well. Maybe you can look at a bunch of flowers at certain times of the year. Number 5 is the mechanical systems. In a perfect world, we have a separate heating and cooling system just for the basement because it does act differently than the rest of the house, but I know that that's not always feasible. However, there are 2 things that I highly recommend that you do when you're finishing your basement. Number 1 is install a fresh air system if you don't already have it. That's going to be either an HRV or an ERV. We've done lots of videos on that on our channel that you can check out. And number 2 is testing for radon. If you're going to be spending a lot more time down in your basement now, you want to make sure that you don't have any radon because high levels of radon can actually be very harmful to your health. So you want to make sure that if that has to be installed, that you do it before you finish your basement. Talk to your contractor about these 2 things. If they're saying that you don't need either of them, chances are you want to find a new contractor. Now, if you live in the Ottawa area and you're thinking of renovating your basement or doing any renovation for that matter, I would love to speak with you. You can reach out through theconsciousbuilder.com or email us directly at info@theconsciousbuilder.com. If you're not in the Ottawa area and you're wondering how you can support the channel, one of the best ways you can do that is by dropping a like to this video down below. You can also subscribe to the channel so you get all the notifications for all the videos that we're releasing every single week. And lastly, if you're wondering what the heck an HRV or an ERV is that I was talking about, you can watch this video here. Until next time, I'm Casey Gray, and remember to live consciously.